Good morning, students. Hope you are doing well. The lecture that I put on e-learning, lecture number 9, some students ask me, I think there is no voice. So I think there was a problem with the recording. So at that moment it looked good, but I think it's a loss of voices. So I'm again recording this lecture, hazards and its classification, and today, inshallah, I will put under the model. So I will replace the lecture number 9, the previous one, with the new recording lectures. So in this lecture we will discuss hazards and its different classifications. There are different classifications of hazards. So all we will discuss thoroughly in these lectures. So before we start, off and on we already introduced about the hazards and harm. So hazard is actually a potential source of a harm to a worker, and harm is a physical injury or damage to the health. So just these two terminologies sometime maybe it's confusing, so it's better to just make understanding about the concept about these two terms. So in this example I will highlight the importance or the difference between these two terms. So for instance, workplace hazard, example of hazards and example of harm. So here you can see if the workplace hazard is anything, and the example of hazard is a knife, and the harm will be cut. And similarly, if we see like a source of energy is a workplace hazard, and electricity is a hazard, and shock will be the harm. And similarly, the floor, wet floor condition, and slippery, there are the chances of the harm. So just to explain or the differentiate between harm and hazards, this is a good example. In this slide, a couple of more terminologies we will define. For the first one is risk. Risk is a probability or threat of damage that someone will be harmed by the hazard, so it's called a risk. An accident is any unplanned event that results in injury or ill health of people. And exposure, so this term may be commonly used in 3-4 lectures, very or maybe like throughout the course we use this terminology very often. Exposure is the contact with the hazard or a chemical that cause injury. So the dose of the exposure will be different according to the hazards. For instance, if there is a chemical, radiological, or biological exposure, so their dose will be different according to the chemical, radiological, or biological exposure, and their limit is also a different one. There are different types of hazards. In this lecture we will cover chemical, mechanical, psychological, biological, physical, and ergonomic hazards. So all these hazards somehow you can feel on, can observe, or you can study like in the lab conditions or any other workplace. Physical hazards consist of all the things like noise, vibration, radiation, lighting, heat, cold, sleeping, etc. So all these include in the physical hazards. The most important one is ionizing radiations and non-ionizing radiation. They also fall under physical hazards. So ionization radiation, all those come under extra gamma, alpha, beta particles. Those are part of radiological stuff. So though there are more chances like this stuff can has more exposure, or the chances of exposure. And of course these particles have bad the effect on the health if its care is not taken in certain situation. For instance, they can cause cancer, lung, bone, thyroid, congenital abnormalities, or leukemia if the exposure is prolonged, as well as in the chronic cases. So non-ionizing radiations are ultraviolet radiation. So most of the people, even the every student who are working in the biolabs, so they have work uh, on the analysis of the DNA, protein, etc., right? And any genomic components, if they are working, so they use this equipment, UV lights. Although there are different instruments where this UV light is protected, but in some cases, in some safety cabinets, and also some in the rooms, those are the fitted with UV light for to decontaminate certain microorganisms. So sometime by mistake, they can face this ultraviolet radiation. In case of chemical hazards, which may present working environment, all gases, vapors, mist, aerosol, fume, dust, liquids. So all these things under comes under chemical hazards. So aerosol is a very sensitive because it's a suspension of fine solid particles or liquid droplets in air and other gases. So for instance, this is the aerosol or droplet. So this is very they suspended in the lab environment. Okay, so if some chemical you open and then might be like they come out and they suspended, so they are very dangerous, of course. In case of solvents, they can affect on the neuropathy or the skin or the kidney or the liver, as well as leukemia, anemia. So the agriculture workers mostly they face a lot of chronic headache or memory impaired skin disease or cancer due to the pesticide, nematicide, and herbicides. So there are different chemicals those are spraying into the fields onto different crops to protect against certain pest diseases. And these, if the proper PP is not followed, or like the PP is not wearing, so then there are chances of these diseases, because these people are facing or they are exposed mainly with these chemicals. Gases also fall under chemical hazards. Carbon monoxide, sulfur, these are the very common gases, are like a liquid gases, dissolved gases are available like in most of the labs, and they can cause respiratory irritation or affects your body deprived from oxygen. So mostly lab workers are have more exposure to these gases, because usually like students they don't have more exposure because they just work like part-time or like off and on. But the lab workers or technicians, those are more, if they have the chance, if they did not take care, so then might be there are chances, although there are certain SOPs to use these gases. Then comes biological hazards. So this hazard is very common in biolabs, especially there are more than 1,400 pathogens that can infect a human. So you should just not be scared about these pathogens. For instance, if you are working in plant sciences, so mostly these pathogens, for example, if you are working animal or human sciences, or like a human science, because these are the zoonotic organisms, microorganisms, for instance, they can infect human, and there are possibility the same pathogen can also infect the animals. Okay, because they have like the system, or like they need what are the basic requirements of both individuals they have. But any pathogens that can infect human or animal, so they are at the moment they are not like infect the plants, and vice versa, because they have both plant sciences and animal or human sciences, so both have like a different requirements to establish the pathogen into the plants or the animal or humans. Okay, so but of course the plants have some other organisms that might be they can cause some disease. For example, some fungus like coccidiomycosis. Okay, so this is the only, so it cannot infect the animal or the human, but for instance this bacteria brucellus, like the milkman can infect, and of course the animal can infect, but not like the plant side. And similarly, the bird flu, hepatitis viruses, A, B, C, D, and there are HIV and COVID-19. So well known, like nowadays we know like the COVID-19 about. Okay, so there are certain parasites, protozoa, and some fungi. Okay, but make sure like only like the animal side and the human side. So these are the zoonotic diseases or the viruses or the pathogen, and they can cross like a human to the animals, but not like across other species like towards. Psychosocial hazards includes work-life experiment-related stress. So sometime might be if you're doing research in your master thesis and your experiments are not working properly. So there are chances you go under related stress. And of course sometimes the emotionally like some people so they start like bullying. So there are these are kind of social psychosocial hazards. And of course some it might be like there are chances of the violence so between the lab workers. And of course there effects on occupational stress and anxiety, depression, cardiovascular disorder. So this is over like psychosocial hazards, but this is not like, for example, part-time or like for one course, like the student start work in the lab or like 1 year for the thesis, right? But mostly, for example, these psychosocial hazards, to me, I think this is the best explanation for the research institutes or research labs. Those are like people are working 10 years, 15 years, or like 20, 25 years, like the long durations. And then there are, because of course they are doing different experiments and different research, so sometimes that happen these hazards. Mechanical hazards, since mechanical sciences, so they are dealing with the heavy machinery, and of course their hazard will be related to the machinery. And if the machinery of course the machinery has a lot of hazards, okay. So due to some reasons, so we I mentioned like a few hazards like the sources, for instance, outdated machines, unsafe designs, complex machinery, or poor maintenance. Of course, what are the hazards? So they can cut or can injury or fracture the workers, right? So if any of thing is the malfunctioning, so there are of course there is a maximum chances of these hazards, and this is the very complicated. So let's discuss about the hazard classification. So hazards are categorized into groups, and which are further broken down into classes, and then these classes are divided or broken down into the categories. So groups, classes, and then categories. So if we talk about the hazard categories, as I mentioned, so the hazard categories are from category 1 to category 4. So the category 1 is the highest hazard, so while category 4 is the lowest hazard. And compared to 1 and 2, of course, the 1 is the highest and 2 is the lowest one. Okay, so these are the four categories of the hazards. So we have four hazard categories are divided into four categories, and sometimes these categories are also divided into subcategories. So for instance, from category 1 to category 2, there are also subdivisions or subcategories in between these two. For instance, you can see 1A, category 1A, 1C. So here, so 1A is the highest or greatest level of category compared to 1C. So it's a less hazardous than 1A, because 1A is most closer to one category, right? And of course 1C is a little far. Okay, and similarly if we compare like a 1C with 2, so of course so 2 is less hazardous than 1C. Okay, and similarly if there are in between 1D or like more categories, so this is just example. Okay, so it may be like there are more subdivisions or subcategories. uh, in this slide I just gave you the hazard identification. One example, just I take the flammable liquids, and how like different groups or classes and categories we can identify for this flammable liquids. For instance, flammable combustible is a physical hazard of this group, and hazard classes are like the gases, flammable gases, aerosol, liquid, and solids. And in this case we will only check with the flammable liquids. So flammable liquids has these four categories, okay. So we will discuss only one class, so flammable liquid. Okay, so flammable liquid has four categories. So here you can see flammable liquid, 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 and depending on their flash point temperature as well as boiling temperature, so these categories are divided. So you can see here, and of course this reflect their the more hazards. For instance, in category 1, flammable liquids have flash point temperature less than 23 degrees Celsius, while boiling point temperature is equal or less than 35 degrees Celsius. If we compare this category 1 with the category 4 liquid flammable liquids, so the flammable liquids, those fall under category 4, have flash point temperature more than 60 degrees Celsius, and boiling temperature less than or equal to 93 degrees Celsius. So you can see like why these categories are divided, because these the temperatures are very different, and you can see between second and three and fourth also. Okay, so flash point is the lowest temperature at which liquid can form or ignite or can catch the fire in the surface of the liquid. Okay, so from this example you can understand how the hazard and identification, you can identify the hazards. So follow this. In this slide you can have one example of a hazard class. So for instance, EQ toxicity is one hazard class, and its general description is this class covers the products those have immediate and serious toxic effect on the health. So, and also similarly we have chronic toxicity or chronic, the, so maybe in some classes, right? And there is a exposure is prolonged. Okay, so the effect is not immediate, but it's prolonged. And if the class hazard is a skin corrosion or irritation, so it contains caustic or acidic materials that damage the skin or the contacts. And if there is a carcinogenicity, then it means to cause the cancer in humans when exposed to them. Okay, this is the description of about these classes. So these are the just examples of hazard classes. Now we will discuss about these classes. Overall, there are 9 classes. All hazards are divided into 9 classes, 1 to 9, and this order of these class numbers does not indicate whether the degree of exposure or degree of danger. Okay, so these are not the divided or distributed or align according to the degree of danger. No, this is just mentioned like that type of hazard. So we will discuss these classes individually. Class 1, explosives. So the chemicals, those are very rapid burning of substances or mixture of substances in the presence of oxygen or air. So those are explosive, and this class 1 is divided into 6 divisions. So division 1.1 are those substances that have explosion hazard, for instance nitroglycerin. And in division second, substances that have projection hazard. I mean, like once there is explosion, so they also project, the projector. So projection, so it goes like up. Okay, so for instance like a fireworks, so how they project upward. So division third is the substances that have fire hazard and either a minor blast hazard or a minor projection hazard. So for instance certain type of gunpowders. In most of the, I think some of the chemist labs, they have all these different powders or the different chemicals. So maybe not all labs, the bio labs have all these things, but of course we are talking about overall in general. So some labs contain some chemicals, some not. Division 4 substances contain that present no significance header like smoke signals, and division 5th are the substances that have mass explosion hazard, but there is a little probability of fire or explosion under normal conditions, blasting explosives. Division 6 substances which contain only extremely insensitive substances, and which demonstrate very little chances of accident, explosion or fire. Explosive, extremely insensitive. So these are the 6 divisions of class 1 explosive materials. Class 2, and also certain classifications also say like alphabets A, B, C, D. Okay, so sometimes there are different US and European Union or Canada distribution. Okay, so we are using, sometimes use like for example the class 2 also called as a class A. Okay, so the gases, but this is of course it's the same for A and the two the gases. So since the gases are different types of gases are used in the labs, for instance compressed gas, liquid gas, refrigerator or dissolved gas. So all these gases they also divided into 3 divisions, for instance flammable gases, butane and propane, and Division second, non-flammable, non-toxic gases. These gases replaced oxygen in an atmosphere, and oxidizing gases, they contribute oxygen to a fire. So for instance, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and sulfur. Toxic gases known to be are suspect of being toxic or corrosive. They are fall under division number 3. Those are chlorine and sulfur dioxides. So these are the three divisions of gases. Those are under class. So class 3 or B contains flammable materials, flammable liquids which give off flammable vapor at below a flash point temperature. For instance, chloride flash point temperature is 29 degrees Celsius. So I think I forgot to put the degree here. Okay, and benzene flash point temperature is 11 degrees Celsius. So class 4 flammable solids. So those are the substances liable to spontaneous combustion when in contact with water flammable gases. So there are three divisions of class of 4. So division 1, self-reactive substances and some explosives which readily catch fire and which can cause fire through friction. So magnesium powder or matches. So that's why whenever we plan area in the lab for the storage, so we always take care about according to the classes of these chemicals. Division seconds of class 4 contains substances liable to spontaneous combustion, including mixtures and solutions which ignite within 5 minutes of meeting air or may heat up contact with air. Examples are sodium sulfides and white phosphorus. So division third contains substances which on contact with water are liable to become spontaneous flammable or give off flammable gases in dangerous quantities. Silicon or aluminum silicate. So these are the different divisions of flammable liquids, solids, those fall under class 4. Class 5 or class C contain oxidizing hazards, and there are two divisions of oxidizing hazards. Division 1, oxidizing substances will under certain some circumstances produces their own oxygen. For this reason, oxidizing substances increase the risk and intensity of the fire in combustible material with which they come in contact. Most oxidizing substances react violently with liquid acids, creating toxic gases. For instance, hydrogen peroxide and sodium peroxides. In class 2, organic peroxides which decomposed at a high temperature resulting in harmful flammable gases or vapors. It is particularly important to avoid contact with the eyes at all costs. So this is a this is a footnote. Okay, so the organic peroxides. So it's very really important to take care while working on these organic peroxides. So class 6 toxic materials or class 6 or D, it contains toxic materials, toxic and infection substances, and is made up of two divisions. Division 1 contain material which are potentially fatal or may cause permanent damage if inhaled, swallowed, or absorbed through the skin, or may burn the skin or eyes upon contact. So arsenic, hydrocyanic acid, and mercury compounds are very dangerous. The second division contains infectious substances are those known to be expected to contain microorganisms including bacteria, virus, fungal, parasites, etc. and other agents which cause disease in human or animals. So biomedical waste and infections. See, humans and animals, these are zoonotic diseases. Those can cause, the infection in both ways, like in humans and similarly in the animals. So these are the main sources, right? So biomedical waste and infectious substances. So infectious substances can be like a blood, serum, or like any samples, okay? And if you're working on the animal side, similarly, the if you know the animal or like their the substance. Class 7 contain reactive materials and the products which can undergo dangerous reaction if subjected to heat, light, pressure, shock, water, air. All radioactive materials are dangerous to a greater or lesser degree because they emit radiation which is invisible and may damage body tissue. So uranium, metal, and uranyl nitrate. So these all reactive materials fall under class F or 7. and class 8 or E contain corrosive materials, and these corrosive materials are the substances by which a chemical reaction will happen, will cause severe damage when in contact with the living tissue or eyes. So examples are acids or sodium hydroxides, and materials which are anhydrous corrosive gases, skin corrosion irritation category 1 you see. So the skin corrosion, so you remember the skin corrosion category or the class we covered in the initial slides. I gave the example. So serious eye damage, also eye irritation category 1. So these are also corrosive materials are very dangerous. Class 9 contains miscellaneous dangerous substances, and those are hazardous for the aquatic environment as well as for the ozone layer. So those are contained under this class 9. Since we cover different classes and there are different substances or the chemicals, those are really very dangerous and they have like a high toxicity, right? And so that's why I add a couple of slides regarding these equipments. This might be like a particular PPE for certain working well for certain classes of chemicals, respirators. So in an oxygen deficient atmosphere, we need the respirators when chemical permissible exposure limits are exceeded. So especially like the pesticide, the people who are working or agri worker or the uh, farmers, so when they are dealing with the pesticide and in institution where air contamination is suspected but levels are unknown, for example confined spaces, large chemical spills, hazard waste sites. So because there is a there are like mostly there are chances of leakage of different chemicals. For instance, if in the lab, so hazardous material is if there is a spillage, of course the droplet aerosols can suspend it into the lab environment. Okay, so that time might be we need these respirators. Here you can see under which situation like this oxygen deficiency happen. So since normally like a 21% oxygen is normal that air contains, okay, an area which is like showing this is 19.5 to like this, so this is the deficiency, oxygen deficient area. Okay, so where we need like these respirators and other things. Okay, and also if the oxygen fall from 8% to the 0, so this is cause a dangerous area. So here of course the immediate death happen. So here there is a survival, but of course needs a certain the equipments for protection or maybe need the oxygen sources. Okay, so this zone is very important. So this is the last slide. There are about of course 600 chemicals, those are like under DOSH, Department of Safety and Health Regulations of US. So they have showing like 600 chemicals, those have permissible exposure limits. Okay, and most of these limits are based on 8 hours exposures. Okay, but some have short-term exposure limits 15 minutes. So depending on the chemical. Okay, so some chemicals 8 hours and of course some chemical 15 minutes. Okay, as I mentioned, acute and chronic effects. So they have actually a ceiling limits, for example, from up to lower, from okay. So they can be exceeded even for an instant. The limits are based on the levels at which harmful effects are first known to occur. Okay, so these limits, according to these, like the levels of the harmful effects. Okay, so this is all about this hazard and its classification and classes, categories, like these things. And I repeat this lecture, so I think maybe I will a bit faster because second time I just recorded this lecture, and but it's hopefully like it's a very short, like only 30 minutes lecture. So thank you so much. So we have one more lecture, so after that inshallah, so we will discuss on Wednesday about the exams, etc. Okay, so thank you so much. Stay healthy.